jubilant period in Indonesia startup investing, whereby everybody wants a piece of Indonesian startup and people pouring in money. The result of that is these startups suddenly growing very rapidly without proper governance, skill. These startups are starting to collapse like a house of cards, and it's not a valuation game. You're there to genuinely build a good business, to create value. People get lost in the weeds. There needs to be more effort to improve our talent pool on software engineering compared to some other countries. India is like a totally different level where we are right now.
Welcome to Hard Truths. Today I'll be chatting with Gary Khoeng on the state of Indonesia's startup ecosystem and what's next. Gary is a partner at Vertex Ventures Southeast Asia and India and based in Jakarta. Now let's talk to him. So Gary, I was reading a report recently, and then it says that Indonesia's private capital deal volume has declined like 34% to just 85 deals in 2024. And the deal value has plummeted like 66% to just 438 million. So what are the fundamental factors you believe that is responsible for this downward trend?
Yeah, sure. I think there are many of them. Of course, one that many would suspect already are the overall global macroeconomic situation. But there are other kind of like Indonesia-centric issues that would, I would say, contribute to that kind of trend. The first is that in Indonesia, we have seen actually several mega IPOs. This includes the IPO of like Goto and Bukalapak and all that. And that was really a light at the end of the tunnel in terms of the Indonesia story, especially as investors. Unfortunately, the shares of these companies have not been doing very well. Again, as I said, probably contributed by some other factors such as macroecon and all that stuff. So I think that kind of perhaps caused some confidence question on the exit story in Indonesia. The other potential explanation could be the fact that last year we were going through our pemilu, which is the general election for our new administration, right? Because the previous administration has stayed for 2 terms and that's done. And of course, with such new overall administration, people, views, ideologies, perhaps people are doing a little bit of a wait and see. So this happened quite more significantly towards the first half and second half of 2024. But now we have kind of seen a little bit of an outcome of what the new administration is trying to do. So perhaps that would no longer affect the pressure in terms of kind of like deal flow and all that stuff on Indonesia.
In your opinion, this caution, is it justified, or is the Indonesian tech ecosystem still strong in your opinion?
Yeah. I think the one thing that I kind of forgot to mention also is that we've been having a lot of bad news recently, especially in terms of one of the larger and more marquee names, supposedly marquee names in Indonesian startups, whereby they were entangled in fraudulent activities, whether it is on a company level or even on the founder level. So I think that also contributed to some of these questions that we have on Indonesia. Now, that said, I think your question was, is it that bad or actually it's stronger than what it looks, right? Now, I feel like as an Indonesian, I may be a little bit biased on this, but I do believe that Indonesia still have the potential. However you cut it, Indonesia is a big part of Southeast Asia. And when we look at Southeast Asia as a region, you really cannot make it in terms of returns as an investor without Indonesia. In terms of the economy, in terms of the number of people, we're the largest there. So could we be stronger than what we look right now? As of now, yeah, I think so. The question is, how do we get back where we were perhaps less than a decade ago, when we were experiencing some of the positive growth sentiment in Indonesian startup ecosystem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You mentioned about the corporate governance issues, fraudulent activities. What contributed to these, in your opinion?
I would classify into two things. One would be kind of like founder integrity. The other one would be company mechanisms to minimize fraud. This founder integrity, what can be done about it? I feel like these bad actors exist anywhere in the world. It's really hard to say, we can be a purist country without any bad players. It probably is part of this growing pains as we mature our startups and tech ecosystem. And if we can weed out these bad actors before they proliferate, that would be one way we can help out on that. The other category is kind of like the company's inability to prevent these fraud in the first place. When you're in tech startup, you are innovating on new business models, a new way of doing things, disrupting the old way of doing things. It is inevitable that these bad actors could take advantage of new loopholes or weaknesses in your system that you're earnestly trying to cover in the first place.
What would be an example of this?
I think there is this P2P fintech company recently that was in the news quite big. They lost quite a significant amount of money because a borrower was able to game their system when use 270 or so identification to borrow like millions of dollars and then ran away. Why? Well, because they're just doing new ways of lending that banks or traditional multi-finance was not doing before, and perhaps may not be regulated as tightly as banks and other financial institutions to these P2P fintech lenders nowadays, right? So that could be a big issue as to why this happened to them. Yeah.
Okay. So are investors to blame for any of these cases?
I don't think you can blame investors per se, because investors invest. The company itself needs to be led, managed, and operated by the founding team. And typically, venture investors only take a minority investment on the company. So the idea is not to be involved operationally. That said,
but you are part of the board and part of the
correct.
governance.
So fair enough. Yeah. So that said, investors are supposed to share some responsibility on what has happened and how to minimize what has happened. So I make that distinction. It's not blame, because blame indicates cause. So it's not the cause. But yes, in terms of governance, I think investors should take a more active role and I guess be braver, to be disciplined and to be strong against founders who may disagree or may try to take shortcuts. So you may have to take a harder stance, which I think in general, investors nowadays are. Yeah.
And some of the founder fraudulent activities, right? This has been happening across stages for several years. Why is it that investors can't catch these?
I wouldn't say it has happened for many years. I would say these things are uncovered more recently in the past year or so, perhaps up to 2 years ago. There was this jubilant period in Indonesia startup investing whereby everybody wants a piece of Indonesia startup, and people coming in, we know big funds, not just local funds, but regional funds and international funds coming into Indonesia and pouring in money. The result of that is these startups suddenly growing very rapidly without the proper governance, perhaps skill, perhaps founder experience, perhaps many other factors. So what happens is that now that they have had several years to grow exponentially without proper guardrails, and when things get shaken, things meaning like global macro econ, things are not doing very well. The music has stopped, right? Some of these startups that do not have proper guardrails are starting to collapse, like a house of cards, and the collapse could be, for example, due to fraud, right? So it's not that it has been going on and then suddenly nothing has been done. I feel like, at least in my opinion, this is more like a recent phenomenon because of what has happened in the past 5 to 7 years. So now that we know, of course, we have to ideally do something about it, not just from an investor perspective, but also from the founder perspective and other players in the ecosystem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what should the different players, like the founders, investors, and the government regulators do?
Yeah, I think the government has been very sensitive with the situation, especially with regards to fraud on the financial sector. The OJK has been acting and reacting to what has been happening. Now, perhaps they should do more. Perhaps the founders, the players, right, the startups need to be entwined a little bit more with regulators to help each other out, right? And then from an investor perspective, I think I mentioned it before, I think governance need to take a bigger, I guess, spotlight in what we do, which I feel like many are doing right now. And it's not like we didn't do it before. It's probably not enough. So yeah, these are things that we should be doing.
You also mentioned both skill of the teams, especially when it was inflated. A lot of startups are growing really fast. Maybe the skill was not there to really scale. So in comparison to, let's say, 10 years ago, right, the quality and characteristics of the startup teams itself, what has changed? Has it improved?
Okay, I got a caveat. I invest in early stage companies, a company that typically is only in seed. They're going through a product market fit situation to get where they are right now. So a lot of founders that delve into these kind of like startups are typically young, perhaps out of college, perhaps some sort of a short industry experience, and they decide to jump ship and do a startup. So I think the profile of these young, ambitious, passionate individuals who want to make the jump into entrepreneurship has not really changed per se from 10 years ago. As I said, there will always be bad actors. Unfortunately, if they're good at hiding themselves, then it's hard to catch. But we cannot paint the whole room the same color as them.
Yeah.
Because there are some good founders that I've been working with, even in my own portfolio, even with outside of my own portfolio, who I respect very much and are doing very well. So I feel like in terms of quality, we still have it. It's just that it's not like it used to be worse before, now it's better, or there used to be better people, now it's worse. Not really like that. But what is sure is that there are fewer of them nowadays. And this is probably due to the sentiment of the funding winter, the belief that perhaps if I make a startup, it'll be hard for me to fundraise anyway.
Yeah.
So why should I quit my job and raise money and do a startup to raise money, right? So this, I guess, negative circle continues, and in a way, it affects the number of people, number of entrepreneurs, and therefore the number of startups being started recently.
I've read that there is a shortage of tech talent in Indonesia. Yes. Is that still the case, or is there a trend that you're seeing where, increasingly there are more people in tech with tech capabilities?
Yeah. Unfortunately, with regards to tech talent like software engineers, if you're referring to that, I haven't seen any stark improvement from what it was before. I believe that good tech talent are still in short supply in Indonesia. I think there needs to be more effort to improve our talent pool on software engineering. I think compared to some other countries, like perhaps like India is like a totally different level where we are right now. And plus
Vietnam and Southeast Asia.
Sure. One thing though, I feel like with the advent of AI, perhaps the future of coding would be very much complemented and supplemented by these AI engines. Meaning, like, we may be able as a country to find a solution to the fact that we have fewer tech talents, but then with the advent of AI, with few tech talents, we can do more. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think that could be like a good outcome actually out of all this AI story, to be frank.
Yeah. So what are the sectors that are like interesting at the moment?
Yeah, so I think, as I said, Indonesia as a whole, I mean, as an economy, is not in its best shape, but I think this applies to other countries in the world as well. But there's one thing that Indonesia is strong at, of course, I think, and this is not necessarily in the context of startups and tech. One, we have a lot of natural resources. That's just fact. So what we can do with it in terms of driving country towards, further industrialization or being in the forefront on certain sectors, such as, batteries or like electric vehicles or whatnot, because of our minerals, that could be one thing. Now, the other thing is that the people, we have a lot of people
Both largest.
here. So that is a strength, which means that we have a lot of consumers, and the consumer sector is going to be driving a lot of the economy going forward. And everything that is derivative of the people will benefit in terms of what sectors are strong, right? This could go back to financial services, perhaps healthcare, and other parts, right? The other thing is that we are an archipelago, so infrastructure is always a challenge, but therein lies the greatest improvement we can happen upon. Right? Infrastructure means roads, logistics, internet access, and all that stuff.
Yeah. So I was looking at the sectors where most number of deals happened last year. I think the number one was fintech. Second one was logistics, and
also consumer, actually.
Yeah,
because especially in tougher times like this, it doesn't mean that individuals do not spend. When things are hard, it just means that we have less purchasing power. People are still spending. So consumer, if you target the right demographics at this current period of this bear market, then you could potentially be doing well. There are F&B brands in Indonesia that have actually been hyped up very well because they cater to perhaps the middle to the bottom of the pyramid, but are doing very well and are always full.
I read this over the last 5 years, the middle class purchasing power has been declining, and apparently around 9.5 million people has fallen out of the middle class bracket.
Yeah.
So you mentioned then the companies can cater either to the premium segment or like on everydays, like things that are maybe inflation proof, that something people have to buy, like essential goods. Is that the two opportunities to focus on?
Yeah. Right now, I think in a way I would tend to agree with what you just said. Correct. Yeah. So I think companies need to adapt with the current situation. There are companies out there that have adapted and have that I've seen success.
What are those companies? Like, if you could give some examples.
So yeah, there are several examples in retailing. Company called K-Life. So that company was very interesting because they were able to offer the same experience and the type of items that a company like KKV or Miniso would bring, but for the masses. And these are items that are probably manufactured outside of Indonesia, like in China, where it's very cheap but unbranded. And these are the opportunities that we need to find as investors to invest here.
Yeah. So I've been reading a lot of articles on what are the sectors that investors are interested coming to 2025. One that's often repeated by a lot of investors is healthcare. So in healthcare, what are the opportunities? And is it also again going with the similar theme of shrinking middle class? So you need more value for money kind of services, or?
Not necessarily. I think it's not about the shrinking middle class, right? So I think healthcare, in my opinion, is actually more straightforward than that. We simply are underserved and underdeveloped in terms of that sector. And what I mean by that is that the number of healthcare professional per population is very low. I think some stats out there has been thrown out. We're actually lower than India, you know. So the healthcare situation in Indonesia is actually quite stark. So that also means that there's a lot of opportunity, right? And that is something that we have seen as well. Now, again, I think there are a lot of private equity activities, especially in later stage healthcare. So I would say like hospitals and all that stuff. As a VC, as a venture investor, we do see a lot of opportunities on the clinic side. So these are like smaller healthcare providers and operators, not as big as hospitals, but would be serving, again, the underserved, the middle and the low. So, for example, there's this company called Fillmore, who specializes in building clinic chains for female health and maternity basis. Because, again, the stats that were mentioned was all for general healthcare, and this also applies to female and maternity. So it's a very low hanging fruit in terms of opportunity that people can, entrepreneurs can grab onto.
I was looking at the exports of Indonesia, because exports is a way to really look at what the country is really capable in terms at a global stage, right? So most of it was, like you said, a lot of commodities, minerals, natural minerals, but then there were like these manufacturing exports, especially electronics and textiles and stuff in the 2000. But that's not there now. So it's like the country deindustrialized. What just happened?
China and Vietnam happened. So a long time ago, maybe decades ago, yes, we have quite a big garment industry. With regards to electronics, we do a lot of assembly as well in the past. So then I think when a lot of manufacturing moved to China, we simply could not compete with them. The result of which is that more of such industries business go to those countries.
Yeah.
We have fewer. If we can do it in a more cost competitive way than those two countries, then we'll be back there. Now, how do we get there? So I would say I would probably start on labor productivity and labor costs. That's like a big thing because these particular sectors that you mentioned usually employ a lot of people, especially the garment factories here, the ones that recently closed. They employ like thousands of blue collar. So we need to improve the quality of our blue collar. Secondly, perhaps government intervention to actually support these industries. Those are the two main things that would get us back there.
What are your thoughts on Dhanantara, the sovereign fund that Indonesia is launching? And there are also these efforts to centralized or state-owned enterprises as well as infrastructure and development projects. Would all these initiatives lead to better FDI? What are your thoughts?
I think that's the hope. Whether or not that can happen, I'm not sure. But I think what I've read is that the idea is that they want to replicate what Temasek is in Singapore in Indonesia through Dhanantara. So if a model like this works very well in Singapore, then the hope is that a similar model could do well in Indonesia. Now, of course, there are a lot of risks when you centralize this kind of, it becomes big, right? A lot of the big SOE actually falls under Dhanantara. So there could be a lot of pitfalls in terms of mismanagement, misuse. But if done well, then yeah, perhaps it could be a good learning that we can get from Singapore and apply it to Indonesia.
So how does this improve FDI though?
If we have like a stable economy with a clear direction and it can be represented by this entity and their intent and their desire as to what industries they want to focus on in Indonesia within the next short to medium term, then that would improve investor confidence in general, not just venture investors, but I think investors in general. So then if that happens, then naturally there'll be more interest to invest in Indonesia.
Let's imagine you're a foreign investor. What would be your concerns like in investing in Indonesia at the moment?
Stability, I think. Yeah. I think that was the
Political
main
stability?
thing. Economic stability and political stability.
Okay. What learnings would you take forward into your own personal investment journey as an investor in Indonesia? And then what would also your warnings be in terms of pitfalls for founders?
I think we don't have a crystal ball. We do our best to assess the business and the founder. And I think we need to do that and more. The second thing, as I mentioned, I think when things were doing very well, companies were growing very fast, a lot of money are knocking on their doors to give the money here to the startups in Indonesia, I meant. It's very hard to give constructive feedback to founders because they may think that what they're doing is correct because money is flowing in. But sometimes those shortcuts that are being used may bite us in the future. So to be able to kind of like rein in such behavior, but in a constructive way, I feel like is very valuable. It's not just about brainstorming things with the founder, but making sure that proper guardrails are also built. For example, financial audits on fast-growing companies are typically lagged. Whereas ideally, you would have audited financial statements by the end of the year or early in the next year to make sure that everything's in line, right? But actually, a lot of startups in Indonesia, that part lags. So I think a lot more needs to be done. And that's also related to the governance side. The second part of the question, what pitfalls founders should avoid. It's easy to lose control as a founder when things are moving too fast. And sometimes it's not necessarily their fault or because they're incapable of doing so, but there's just too many variables and factors happening at the same time. Perhaps slowing things down, being more prudent, more wise in their actions on a general basis, I'm talking on a general basis, would help them avoid these kinds of pitfalls that may happen in the future. And then the other thing is that in the past, because of the bull market, founders feel like having increased valuation is like a good thing. It's like, I need to raise at a higher valuation exponentially in subsequent fundraising. But sometimes you don't have to. Like, the more important things is to find the right partner, meaning like the right investors to partner with, and ensure that your product has good market fit and people want to buy it. It's not a valuation game. You're there to genuinely build a good business, a strong value proposition, to create value. So I think that's very important. I feel like people get lost in the weeds. But that's really the true north is to do that.
What would make the ecosystem healthy again, in your opinion?
It's confidence. That's the main thing. Whose confidence? Investors' confidence. One way this could be contribute to is, for example, good exit stories. As I mentioned to you, we had some of these mega exits, which is great, but unfortunately, it didn't last, right? But you need more of these light at the end of the tunnel. There needs to be justification as to why investing in Southeast Asia and Indonesia is a good, lucrative action, right?
Yeah.
And the only way you can prove that is to drive exits, right? Exit doesn't mean IPOs. It could be, potentially trade sales and whatnot. But the point is that if I invest money here, can I generate returns? And if there are more examples happening in the next several years, then it would contribute to improved confidence along with some of the other factors that you already mentioned. So overall, it boils down to, in my opinion, investor confidence. That's the only way we're going to get to the next bull market. Of course, there are other topics we can touch. For example, I think there needs to be a catalyst, something that causes confidence to come back in terms of belief in what opportunity can exist. So, for example, the analogy would be, right? It's not a one-to-one analogy, but the closest analogy I can think of. In the US, back when Silicon Valley Bank situation happened, there was a kind of like a weakness in terms of venture investment. But then suddenly AI happened, right? And people suddenly got back to the bull market because suddenly the advent of these LLMs allow for so many more development, innovation, application that cause people to think like, this is a good time to invest again, right? We need something like that here. If that happens, then that could help, again, the confidence level for investors to come back and invest here again.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much, Gary. This was great.
Yeah.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah. Thank you.